how to start a new sequence and understand a bit more about the timeline. So if you see the Premiere Pro course project and you open up the sequences folder, you'll see that there are different folders in here. We'll get to that in a minute, but right now you should just have a blank folder with nothing in it. And we're going to start a new sequence. What is a sequence? It's basically a new timeline or a new video where you'll be adding your clips and editing your clips on. So to start a new sequence, you click, there's different ways to do this, but the easiest way to do this from scratch is to click this new item button and choose sequence. This opens up a very confusing menu with lots of different options for different file types and things like that. And so if you have a camera and you know what type of video and format and settings you use on your camera, you might want to pick a very specific preset that's available here. But you might not have one for your camera, so you might need to go over to the settings panel. And within here, you can also choose all of that information. So if you know, for example, that you shot on with a DSLR, and your time base or your frames per second on your camera was 23976, you know that your frame size is 1920 by 1080, etc., you can set this all here manually. But there is a much easier way to do this that I think is going to work for 99.9% of you. If you're watching this and you ever need to create a custom sequence, maybe you do want to create a square sequence, for example, then you'll have to change this to square pixels first, but then you can choose and create a sequence that has a frame size of 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels. And so maybe you are creating something for social media where you need to do this, but if you're just trying to create a sequence that matches the settings of the clips that you've already shot, there's a much easier way to do this. And there's some other more advanced features here if you're shooting with VR and things like that, but that's not really necessary for this lesson. So I'm going to click, well, let me just click OK so you can see what happens. It creates this sequence file, basically, that underneath this folder where we added it. And now on our timeline, we have two tabs. We have the promotional video, which is actually for the Premiere Pro project. And then we have this new sequence right here that is blank. I'm going to close this. I'm going to delete it, actually. And I'm going to show you the easier way. I should have just started with the easier way, but sometimes you need to learn the hard way before you learn the easy way. To do it the easy way, you just find the clip that you want your sequence to match. For example, let's just start with video 1 and drag it into the new item button. And now it created this sequence and it added this sequence that's titled the same as this clip here in this folder. So I'm going to move that over to the sequences and I'm just going to call this sequence 1. Okay. So you're probably like, Phil, why did we go through all that confusing stuff when you could have just told me that? Well, I hope you learned something. But you also notice that now we have this clip on our timeline and we can play through it. The entire clip was added when we just clicked and dragged that into the new sequence. And now this sequence matches the settings of this footage. If you want to see what those settings are, you can go up to the sequence menu and go to sequence settings. And here is that similar menu we saw when setting up a sequence, say that 10 times fast, with all of the settings. Editing mode, custom, frame size, etc. Okay. The one thing that I'll just mention so you understand is that sometimes you shoot at different settings or sometimes you shoot with different cameras. Maybe you shot 4K with one camera and then 1080p with another. Those are resolutions if you didn't if you didn't know yet that. Or maybe you shot at 60 frames per second with one camera and 24 frames on another. What you want to do is create the sequence based off of typically the common footage that you're using or the way that you are going to end up exporting your video. So if you're going to export your video at 1920 by 1080, then create a sequence at that with the footage shot at that format. Or if you want to make sure you export at 23976 frames per second, make sure you use that footage to start your sequence. You can always change this stuff later. You can also export at different frame rates and frame sizes, but in general, you want your sequence settings to match the footage that you're using the most. Now, there's some people that are going to say, Phil, no, that's not right. And I know there are some cases where that's not true, but for those of us just getting started out, that's a good rule of thumb. Another rule of thumb is if you have video of people talking, and I'm not talking about your extra footage of like what we'll call B-roll, your extra footage that you add on top of an interview, for example, or a vlog. But the footage of you talking, that's the clip that you want to start and create the sequence from, okay? We're going to move on to the timeline. I'm going to put that in the very next lesson, actually, so that these lessons aren't so long. But the last thing I want to clarify in this lesson is really when you would use different sequences. I've gotten this question a lot from previous versions of this course and students. So you would use different sequences in different ways. I use them as different versions of a video. For example, I might have a draft and then I'll copy that sequence and then make changes to the copy, and that'll be my second draft. Sometimes if I'm editing a very long documentary, I might have different scenes of the documentary or different interviews where I'll just edit that interview or each interview on a different sequence. Sometimes you will have a project file that is for a series of videos that you don't want a separate Premiere Pro project for every video because you're sharing perhaps the same video clips, the same music, the same other graphics and assets. And so you want that all contained in one project, but you would have a different sequence for every different video. For example, if you're a vlogger and you might want to just create a new sequence for every new vlog, for example. So you can use it as different ways. Usually it's just one sequence per video or doing it with drafts. So for example, if I want, I can just copy this. So copy and paste, or just on your keyboard, Command C, Command V. On a PC, that'd be Control C, Control V. And now I can see this version 1. So sequence 1, V1, or whatever you want to call it. And now I can open up this new version and make my edits. And so that way, if I'm working with a client and if I ever have to go back to an old version, I can do that easily. Okay, so I know this is a lot, but I hope that you're learning a lot and learning everything. I'm sure you're like, Phil, let's get to the editing, and we're going to get there. And first, though, I want to go over the timeline and understanding this in the next lesson.